these are the few thoughts to start with. I'd very much like us to think about the spaces between disciplines as creative spaces for answering the big question, how we're going to get the trillions to move into the solutions to climate change in time. So I'm interested in the connection between law and policy and institutional design and finance and technology innovation. And I'm interested in how creativity and constraint can be put together. So in times of crisis, we're generally pretty good as a species of finding solutions under pressure, but equally, as Freddie and I were just talking about, the world of arts really does understand creativity and constraint. The edge of a canvas, the previous definition of a poem, what is or is not the right form of a novel. These are constraints, and creative people push at the edges of them. Engineers love the idea of having a challenge put to them where often the constraint is just physics, it's just some basic mathematics that they've got to deal with, but given the challenge, they'll want to find a solution. But they often need to be encouraged to find that solution when perhaps the finance people tell them that they have to be careful of costs or whatever. There's some way in which we can take that capacity to create under conditions of constraint and use it to our advantage. The next point, which I know will come out in our conversation, is that there are areas of our economic system that have not yet acquired the set of values that we need in order to be able to make this transition. We're going to look specifically at natural capital, valuing nature in practice as well as in principle, taking some interesting ideas and turning them into things that are actionable because they can be translated into investment products, because they can be put into a financial model. These are sorts of translations between disciplines that we need to do. We also need to look at global equity in its fullest sense. Where does the problem get solved, as well as how? Where does the money need to go? We need to make it rational for an institutional investor in the Nordics to put money in East Africa or Indonesia, or to literally win a battle between coal and renewables in a jurisdiction that has coal. To provide a reason for countries that have recently discovered oil and gas to be part of a transition to an economy where that oil and gas isn't going to deliver them the future they might have expected, but still could be staged, or there could be some way of fitting that current resource into a future resource. Next point, how do we use the economic system in a kind of judo throw against itself? How do we bring to the fore things that are not adequately valued, like waste, for example, and turn them into things that have value in a circular economy? And finally, let's try and understand the power of the exponential. Because we've just been through a period, I guess we're still in a period where we've had to learn the brute reality of the exponential when it's against us, when the exponential is really challenging us. But equally, the exponential is a power, as a force that we can have with us in making this transition, and that is how technology works. Right? It works on itself, it builds its own momentum. And we do have tremendous potential in key sectors of the economy to make that exponential work in our favor. You see it already in power, in the power sector. You see it also when technologies converge, when renewable generation and storage and digital demand side management and electric vehicles, the infrastructure for all hasn't yet been created, but it's happening. And those technologies provide huge opportunity for capital deployment, but also for fundamental changes in the way we run our economy. So let's have a look at how the exponential can work in our favor. I'll leave you with a couple of recent interventions in our kind of think space about this. 3. One, what I think is a brilliant paper emerging out of the Oxford Martin School. The central message is this transition particularly in technologies relating to power, is going to happen faster than people think, at lower cost than people think. And the faster we go, the lower the cost and the more macroeconomic return we're likely to get. That is not a narrative that is widely used in mainstream politics. But it's the result of very careful and thoughtful work done by scientists and academics who are not normally present in the debate that we have about climate. They've come out of mathematics, they've come out of physics, and they're simply looking at probability analysis, learning curves, knowledge retention, and how technology innovation works. The IEA report, many of you will be familiar with the kind of emblematic value of the IEA report that comes out. And I can tell you for years, my colleagues at Climate Change Capital, we used to fight we couldn't understand why the IEA didn't get how innovation was working in renewables, for example. Why their predictions were every year wrong and massively underestimated the potential for renewables to occupy a large percentage of the energy system. Well, this year, boy, have they shifted. It's not just a report. I really encourage you to look at the presentation of the report, because the three speakers, a couple of whom definitely disagreed with strongly in the past, they've changed their tone. It's the narrative, it's the tone, it's the substance has shifted. And they are presenting an energy future where oil demand declines, where renewables take up a higher percentage, and where the ambition gap that we have at the moment, which often is not filled for fear of a cost, their argument is now that is not an economically rational argument. And the last piece, which is a systemic contribution, which I'm proud to have some association with, this report that we call the Paris Effect, the new version is coming out. This is a way of understanding how the Paris Agreement and the processes around it, the ways of gathering in resources, political resources, policy-making resources, law-making resources, is facilitating this transition, is enabling things to come forward faster, amplifying existing effects, making it more likely that barriers get removed to innovation, and celebrating what has been done, so that we don't get ourselves in an overly cynical or nihilistic state of mind, which can happen, let's face it, when we contemplate COP26 coming up, and the worry that maybe it falls short, maybe it doesn't deliver, maybe it's something that's going to disappoint. Well, this report, the Paris Effect, helps you recognize that which has been done, notwithstanding our anxieties. And that's something I think we'd like to focus on in this conversation. All right, now, Kat, why don't you make your intervention? I know where you're going with this, and I'll follow it up, and then we'll go to Fiona.
Amazing. I will just call out the elephant in the room, and I am the same colour as the chair. And it was not intentional, but green finance. So it's really nice to be here with you all today. I love that you ended with an optimistic sentiment, James, because everyone says that we're all going to hell and it's no point. And I cannot stress enough that it's not too late, that COP is important, and that the financial system can help change things. Rather than talk about risk and return, which is what I normally talk about, I will give you some quotes from two of my favourite pals. First one's Harrison Ford, best mate. He'd be ashamed of this decor situation. And Harrison said a couple of years ago at the Global Climate Action Summit, nature doesn't need people. People need nature. He then said, and it was quite chilling, he was up there, had a couple of drinks, so he was pretty into it by that stage. And he said, we can put solar panels on every roof, we can have every vehicle be electric, but as long as Sumatra burns, and as long as we see, fires all around the world, this was 2018, so there was a huge fire risk in many countries around the world, and that's only increased. As long as Sumatra burns, then we haven't made it. We haven't sorted this stuff out. So we need nature. And that really stuck with me, and I think it's a really important focusing comment for me, because it just forces our attention for a second on the risk. And I think when I think about how we change the financial system, it's always good to start with risk. You will have a terrified portfolio manager worried about the losses that they're going to make because they're in stranded assets. You will have a government fretting or burying their huge exposure when they look at the health costs of air pollution, whether that's linked to coal-fired power or linked to massive fires. My own country in Australia lost huge investment actually in Queensland and Western Australia, the big mining states, because a whole bunch of the Scandies, God bless them, pulled out of treasury bonds because of our stance on climate and the huge exposure of physical assets in Australia, infrastructure assets, rail, port, to these fires, and then indeed looking forward to big transition risk. And it's always a bit of a shameful confession that I have, but as every young lawyer in Queensland does, if you're in the energy space, you're doing a coal seam gas transaction or there's some link to the fossil fuel space. And I always think that's a good thing because, know thine enemy a little bit. But the Queenslanders are all about cars, cattle and coal. And if you try and tell them that this is not the way of the future and not the way things are going, they get pretty upset with you. They're a fun bunch, the Queenslanders. But I think what's really important is actually starting that conversation with risk and their exposure. If you're a big cattle farmer and you've got a massive temperature increase, you're exposed. If you've got an inability to see the jobs in a certain region in Queensland, you've got a big climate justice challenge when we can no longer sell coal out of the big dredged port through the Great Barrier Reef. So risk is important for people, but it's also important for financial institutions, and I think that's why it's critical that we have conversations around climate-related financial disclosures, because as another one of my best mates, Larry, said, climate risk is investment risk, and that's a fact. And that means that the old excuses of fiduciary duty can no longer come into play. They just don't, they are wrong, they don't make sense, they can't come into play anymore because climate risk equals financial risk. And so risk is a good place to start. Terrifies people, people think about losing money, and that's a wake-up call. But I think unless we shift into where you went at the end there, James, about opportunity, we never have the full conversation. And so my other quote, we started with Harrison telling us that we need nature, and this is actually a physical risk to us as well as a financial risk. And the other mate's Jerry Maguire, show me the money. Yeah. And I don't think we can have this conversation unless we talk about investment opportunities. It is important to explain that, as you said, renewables are just cheaper. Thank you, German subsidies and Chinese technology. Yeah. This is now just cheaper. I think that comes into play for governments in a really important way because they talk about their people and energy access and affordability. But for an investor community that's chasing yield, for an investor community that is looking for differentiated, uncorrelated returns, it's absolutely critical that they're thinking about transitioning assets, transitioning companies, but also, and this is where I'll end, James, but emerging markets. The absolute opportunity that we see, think about Asia. It is the largest population, it's the most populous continent in the world. It's also the fastest investing region in coal-fired power. Why is that? There is a huge opportunity, digital, green real estate, renewable energy, food, and nature-based solutions in this one region alone. And if investors aren't thinking about Asia as the shifting centre of gravity in the world, then you've completely missed it. So I think I would just end on the opportunity piece and saying it's an absolute critical thing that we look at emerging markets around the world. It is critical that we don't forget Africa. It is critical that we don't look at unproductive Latin America and think that's, it's not going to change, because that's going to be one of the biggest hydrogen hubs in the world, green hydrogen. So I urge you, look at Asia. I absolutely urge you to take a Jerry Maguire lens to everything with Show Me the Money, and I'll hand it back to you.
Karen, we'll come back in particular to how one changes the calculus for investment in emerging markets and what one might want to do, so we'll come back to that. But now we're going to go to Vianne, and I know where you're going to go, so over to you.
He knows that I'm going to go straight to nature, because that's what's in my heart, and I'll explain to you why. And I guess to all of you, thank you for being here and listening into this discussion, and to my fellow very distinguished panelists, thank you. To even be able to have this discussion for me is a reason to be optimistic. I am an optimist at heart, and we've spoken about positive tipping points. And I want to offer us all 3 reasons to be, maybe not cheerful, but at least to be positive. And they are, firstly, that I absolutely believe we are at an unprecedented moment in time, because we have the convergence not only of awareness of these issues, not only of the regulators starting to focus the world's attention on these issues, but we also have technology like we've never had it before. Every single one of us, and including in emerging markets, we're often leapfrogging where we are connected with technology. We have incredible geospatial data, we have data about behavior, we have data about how money is flowing, we have real-time data. This is an unprecedented moment in our history, and that's why I am optimistic that if we can harness these forces as a force for good, then we really have an opportunity to change something. The second reason to be cheerful is the Trojan horse piece. So sometimes I've never been called a Trojan horse, but I usually call myself a double agent, partly because I had the opportunity to travel to some of the world's wild places whilst I was working in finance, to learn from indigenous people how they view the world, to have encounters with nature that I will always remember. And I couldn't forget them. And so when I came into finance and I started to work at FNZ is actually a technology platform, and there are others like us who run something like $1.2 trillion, and that's just us. We are responsible for the technology that retail investors use to think about their investment decisions. And so we often think about change when it comes to sustainable investing from the top down. So the asset owners, talking to the asset managers, imposing exclusions, the policymakers, enforcing rules, etc., etc. But what's interesting is that now, for the very first time, and there are many instances of this, we will start to be able to show you, me, all of us, the impact of our investment decisions. So a new lens on how we allocate our own capital. And that, I think, is profoundly powerful, because it could be catalytic. This is a group of individuals, a powerful cohort that has never had access to this information before. So what could that achieve? Something potentially very, very powerful. And the final thing is that I believe, and I can give a quote, maybe not a Harrison Ford quote, but I just want to share the feeling that I have when I'm with you, and knowing that there are however many hundreds of people up there with sustainability in their titles. My own experience with a network that I run called the Nature Network. There are so many of us working as double agents in industries which perhaps haven't had people like us before. And we are changing things from the inside out. And so whenever I think of what's the quote that motivates me, it's really be the change you want to see. And if we can all do that within our industries, we will affect change.
Marvellous. Now, let's just go back around this notion of how one values nature in practice, where this investment opportunity might lie. It might combine public and private money. We might want to come back to that theme too. It might be dependent upon a public policy intervention. i.e. creating a value stream because public policy decides whether it's carbon or biodiversity or some other value intrinsic to nature that we want to focus on and to attract money to. It might be through the activities of development banks, or we're just about to create a new infrastructure, or have created a new infrastructure bank in the UK that ought to have a natural capital mandate, in my view. These are the kinds of institutions that we need, but maybe you can give us some idea of where this marketplace might be and how the money might flow to where it should do.
Yes, so one of the things that has fascinated me over the last couple of years is the taxonomy. Fascinating.
Yeah.
But fascinating because, for the first time, a profoundly interesting development in the area of recognising the value of biodiversity in every decision made by an investment manager. So there's a disclosure point which asks a couple of questions of the manager of the investment company in which they're invested. And that applies not just to investors who are operating in the EU, but also to investors who are operating or selling into the
market.
EU.
Yeah.
So just to have those questions there, I think is profoundly powerful.
Yeah.
We're thinking about this now. It's going to have to happen. So therefore, metrics will start to have to be generated. And I go back, I fully agree with you, Catherine. It starts from risk. How do we start to understand biodiversity risk and mainstream that into decisions? That could be absolutely, profoundly catalytic to mainstreaming and understanding of the value of biodiversity, and not just every project you're investing in, but really every single dollar of the $120 trillion worth of capital that's invested.
And as you say, we've never been able, until this time, to match a metric that could be designed by an academic department or a research group inside a financial institution with the kind of live, real-time data we can now collect from satellites. I'm sure there are people in the room who actually do this, but the precision of the data, the fact that we can see what's happening with growth in forested land or deforested land. We can see movements into illegal, that produce illegal logging, and we can see it live. I do think that's going to change consciousness. I think there's a difference between our standard way of reporting and monitoring through government and then perhaps to an international institution like the climate negotiations. The how long that takes is going to be severely disrupted by how fast you will be able to see in real time what's going on.
Exactly, and if we look at some of the other developments in the area of disclosures around nature, we've seen the Task Force for Climate-related Disclosures be followed by the Task Force for Nature-related Disclosures. There's a precedent. People start to understand that there's a reason for this kind of disclosure and understanding this. If we think about the Stern report, that was 2006, took us about 20 years to get, 15 years to get to where we are today. Can we halve the time? Can we quarter the time that it would take to get the Dasgupta Review's findings, for example, into play?
Okay, one more on this. So I think that's a very particular challenge. It resonates well in this country because the Dasgupta report was requested by Treasury, just as the Stern report was by Gordon Brown. And yet translating the theory that is in it into the practice of governmental decisions and deployment of public money, let alone the alliance with private money, that's a challenge. It probably is a challenge that needs to be picked up in precisely the way you suggest, i.e. through people who are in institutions and are paying attention to this. And I think also, I'm sure there are folk in the audience who recognise that, unfortunately, we still don't really have the right people around decision-making tables, metaphorically, right? We don't. It's partly a question of knowledge, partly a question of age, possibly also a question of gender, but there's insufficient diversity in our decision-making rooms to make that kind of transformation. And this is something perhaps you and your network can do something about.
It's an interesting question to pose. I think that when I participated in a course with the National Geographic, I did the module on demand reduction for illegal wildlife. And for some reason, the algorithm that was behind this online went wild, and I ended up getting people from all walks of life contacting me and saying, I want to do something about this, I have to somehow combine my passion with nature, with my work and my job, and I said, well, what do you do? And we had 200 people come talking about their life in construction, their life as accountants, their life as actuaries. All I want for Christmas is a passionate actuary, model biodiversity scenarioist. Got a lot of comments when I asked for a passionate actuary.
Open room, open recruitment.
Open room. But
Going once, going twice.
I think it's changing. I think people are listening. I think it's becoming part of the narrative. You see this in the World Bank dialogues, you see it in the Inspire networks. This is happening. It's something that is changing. The discussion is being had, and we have to keep pushing that dialogue.
Right, Cant, I know you spent a lot of time blending different types of capital and trying to find the right place to bring that combined public and private money so that maximum effect is achieved. You've already highlighted the absolute truth that unless we move money in very large amounts to those so-called emerging markets, I wish we had a better phrase, by the way, I'm sure that's the thing we should be working on. But anyway, the parts of the world that are rapidly developing, experiencing energy growth, population growth, new infrastructure being built, that's where the money needs to go. We won't be reaching our targets, whether they're 1.5 or anything, unless the money goes there. Yep. And yet for now, it is perceived, at least, for those who hold capital or make decisions about the deployment of capital in the world, it's perceived as being irrational to move money to those places, principally because of perceptions of risk.
Yep.
And the cost of capital for Tanzania or Mozambique or Indonesia even, or Philippines, is so much higher. So even though we can make a really strong case that the basic economics of these new technologies mean that going clean is smart from an economic point of view, there will be a reward to your economy, there'll be a transition cost, but it's affordable. We are not paying the same price for capital here or in Norway as Mozambique or Tanzania. And we can't solve all of those problems at a stroke, but we need to think about them, right?
Yep. You're hitting on one of my favourite bugbears, James, which is why can't we spend public money in a smarter way? Everything you've just said is right. How wonderful for you. But really, money needs to move to these growth markets, and it's not just because it's the right thing to do, it's good to go clean. These are huge opportunities. As I said before, this is where money should go. If you want to make money, go build some green buildings in Southeast Asia. If you want to make money, that's where you're going to do it. But I think the perception of risk combined with an extremely conservative set of public institutions, to your point earlier, this set of public institutions who have catalytic capital designed to do climate, development, nature, inclusion. What is that money there for if not to crowd in more? And I think that's the huge issue. I mean, you probably all know the numbers, but our multilateral development banks, so the World Bank and others, they have a mobilization ratio of less than 1-to-1. So that means for every public dollar, which is designed to do clean, inclusive, nature positive, net zero investment, every public dollar crowds in less than one private dollar. And partly that's because they're a bunch of old blokes that have been in the World Bank for a really long time, and so they're not quite aligned with their incentives on how to spend that money and how to crowd in private capital. It is a completely different language to talk to the private sector, and that can be terrifying. But I think it's also a mandate issue, and this is why COP, I think, is really critical. It's important, and it's a moment for optimism, because it's, this is where you go, and all of these big donor countries have their pants down, because it's, once again, you've got a $100 billion climate target. You've got a narrative which says your priority is to crowd in private capital. And we've got the numbers. We know that it's going to take 6 trillion every year to meet the SDGs, people and planet. We know that the lion's share of that money is in emerging markets, growth markets, whatever language you're telling me we're using, James. And we know that actually a lot of that's investable, but you've got hurdles, you've got institutional barriers, you've got cost of capital, weightings, which disincentivize from going into infrastructure or into particular high-risk countries. But you also have really clever people and huge increase in commitments from philanthropy, from investment, really mainstream investors who are saying this matters. And you've got really smart people as well who are working with people like Vianne, who are saying, I've got some wind farms or I've got some whatever infrastructure it is, and I need to know how many vultures are flying in and getting killed. So there are ways that, nature comes into everything that we do. The transition to net zero infrastructure creates an economy which is value creating, not just for countries, but companies. But I think if we don't get the public money to be smart money, we're in really big trouble, because we just end up in this situation where we spray, pray, and repurpose.
Yeah.
What's the point?
Yeah, that's not
What
right.
is the point? It's not good enough. And it's also, it doesn't need to be public money forever. I think there isn't enough public money in the world or philanthropic money in the world, so it needs to be used smarter.
Now, often it's enough to have at least part of the risk, or the initial risk, covered, or the back end of the risk, particularly for the nature. If you're going to do, we haven't really talked about carbon pricing and carbon markets, we could do, but those projects need length, they need real length, decadal length, in order to achieve permanence, and that needs to be backstopped with insurance or a government guarantee. The same with some of the energy access projects. They go fast when they start, but you need something at the beginning to make it roll. These are all interventions that are smart.
Just reflecting on that point of yours around even just one component of this legacy system, which is insurance.
Yeah.
So how do you insure against nature risk? We had a very long conversation with the actuaries, who are actually really important in this discussion.
Crucial.
Yes, the actuaries who were advising the IMF, and we talked to them, took that step beyond climate and said, well, what if you were looking at nature risk? And you're looking at nature as defined by the TNFD as living nature, so species abundance, species richness, then you have air, and you have soil, and you have water. So it was really a basket. I said, well, how do you ensure, or even scenario plan for this? And they said, well, first of all, you're liken it to climate. Actually, an insurer is not going to insure you beyond a year or two. They'll insure for weather, but how are we going to disaggregate these baskets and then get someone to actually commit to underwriting the risk of what might happen in not just 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years?
Yeah.
It's a really big issue.
But we do some of this. We're going to get questions just after this last exchange. We do some of this already in other disciplines. So we back-end cover nuclear liability with a combination of private markets and government guarantee. We do that over a 30-year period and plus. We are going to have, I hope, a tremendous response to valuing nature, partly through carbon markets, partly through other. But it's fraught with difficulty. Contested methodologies, concern about integrity, concern about the length, the permanence of these investments. In those circumstances, there simply has to be some combination of public duty, public money, insurance, and private sector deployment. It's absolutely not beyond us to put those things together. I mean, it really isn't. That just takes effort. And the same is true with several of the other transformations. We should be able to get the cost of capital down for those places who are undergoing a transition. And yes, there'll be some conditionality in there. But whether it's currency risk, policy risk, political risk, they're all familiar. They're all familiar. But we've not done the job of combining our institutional capacities. IMF would be one institution, World Bank would be another, regional development banks. And it's one of the things that we should have done by now. And I hope that COP will give us a bit of a platform to focus on this. Because 100 billion is important symbolically, but it's minuscule
It's a flaw.
to what we're talking about. All right, look, Freddie, I think that's probably it. Let's go to the floor. I know there are people in the audience. We haven't talked about China. We probably should. We haven't talked about all sorts of bits and pieces of the story that we probably could, but let's get you to contribute your questions and we'll respond. Chris.
Right.
And just introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Christopher. I'm turning waste into energy, but that's not what I want to talk about. Very, very simple question. I mean, years back, already I would say years back, the scientists and the professors and so on would be able to calculate the cost of not doing anything. The floods, the fires, the pollution, you can top them all up, and it presents a huge bill in the trillions of the trillions. Why is it that it's so difficult to mobilize the money? Why is it that the COP26 is fighting hard to reach that 100 billion, as you say, James? It's nothing, no, in the big bill. Why is it so difficult to see for the politicians and the decision makers that you have to take a long-term view, that the ultimate bill will be in the trillions, let's say 1,000 trillion, and all we have to do is invest 20 trillion now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such a simple equation. Why doesn't anybody see that?
Chris. I mean, exactly. It can be quite dispiriting making these arguments over a long period of time and wondering why it's not obvious. And Nick Stern could ask the same question or respond in the same way, since he tried very hard to make this point a long time ago, as Vian said. And he got caught up in a truly absurd discount rate conversation. Do you remember? I mean, that just discredited mainstream economics, really, didn't it? I mean, the fact that we got into a battle over discount rates, given the proposition you just made. Look, I'll deal with it in a simpler way, in the simple question that's really complex, which is I honestly think this is, just as both of you have said, this is partly a generational shift. It's a question of letting go of orthodoxies. It's of unlearning practices. You know, a lot of people who have reached the top have learned ways to get there, and they've not used their capacities, their mental capacities, their networks, their organizational capacities to solve this problem. They've been highly rewarded often for very reductionist thinking. I know the profession you came from, right? You know the rewards of focus on the thing that produces the return with no distractions. And you get rewarded well for that. It appears in your pay packet. And there's a lot of our critical parts of the economy where that's the case, that there is not much reward for thinking between disciplines, for thinking across disciplines, for collaborating with others. We've massively emphasized competition against others. And the temporal dimension is hard, because the average lifetime of the CEO, you've heard that case, the average lifetime of a politician, you never get a feedback that satisfies you on this problem. The system's too big, so you always discount the future. And I think that's essentially a problem with thinking and consciousness and learned behaviors that we have to unlearn, and we need to be shunted out of those places. I don't know whether you want to add to it, or as we look for other questions, I can't see in the line. Oh, there's questions over here.
We have another question online from Emily Fry, who asks, thanks for your comments today. What do you think needs to happen to ESG frameworks and measurements in order to move towards additionality of impact?
Over to you.
Yeah, why don't you start there?
ESG, yes. Well, personally, I think disclosure is the way forward, painful as it is. If you've ever done a firm's ESG disclosures, you'll know. It's not easy, but I think if we're going to try and be comparable, if we're going to try and compare companies, if we're going to try and then adjust how we value a company based on its ESG performance, we have to be comfortable that we're making appropriate assessments. Currently, the ESG ratings that are in the market are often based on proprietary ways of calculating ESG, which means that you get this incredibly imperfectly correlated score for different companies. So one company might score very highly on one system, whereas it might score very low on another because different weightings are applied to different ways of measuring various parts of its ESG profile. My view is that as disclosure rises and as it becomes mandatory, then we'll be able to start to compare better. But it is a long road, and there are efforts to be able to do this. So I think that the industry does get a lot of stick for greenwashing. I also, though, think that asset managers are trying to understand this new paradigm. They are looking at the data that's available to them, and there's a hell of a lot of it, which is where cutting through the noise and being able to unite the science and bring that science to their fingertips, which is what we're in to do, is profoundly useful as we move forward.
Only to add a sort of behavioural point, but also, yes, transparency, integrity and standardisation, but also it's got to be integrated into mainstream investment decision making. So whatever tools, whatever frameworks, if it sits separate, and there's a little ESG officer over there ticking his boxes, counting his beans, he will have a good time, and then the business will do whatever they're doing without him.
It also needs to feed into training and education, so you can't get your certificate to do this, that and the other unless you've been through this process, otherwise you won't spot problems. It can't also just be snapshot and backward looking, it's got to be forward looking and dynamic. We want to know where the money is going in the future. A long time ago, along with Paul and Tessa, I've started the Carbon Disclosure Project, and all we really wanted to do was to get information into the marketplace. Well, now we have bigger ambitions than that, but even so, it's hard to get the right kind of data to match the right sort of investment decisions we're talking about. And although it's improving in the capital markets, in the public markets, there's a long way to go in private equity. There's a lot of opaqueness, opacity in that space there, and we need to prepare private equity. If they're going to bring things to market, they need to be ready to tell their story. And I hope that we'll just get better at what we mean by ESG. At the moment it's a bit of a cover-all label. It needs a lot more definition and a lot more experience, and as you say, it needs to be applied in people's careers and the way their performance is judged.
Just to say, that is an extraordinary thing that you catalysed, CDP. And now it is moving into water, forests, biodiversity. It's extraordinary how this is starting to become a part of what people want to do and they have to do. And I'm also very encouraged that it's becoming very real in that even loans, credit is being issued to companies on the basis of ESG ratchets, actual targets that will lower the rate of interest.
Yeah, different rates.
It's real,
that's right.
and that's really new and incredibly encouraging.
Now there were questions in the spotlight. I hard to see, but there are questions over here.
Yeah, hi, my name is Adam Woodall. I'm the Chief Executive of Lawyers for Net Zero. And we set up because actually there's a narrative that there's people that are upstairs on the next floor, there's people with sustainability in the title, and there may be some environmental entrepreneurs like our friend here. Basically, it's their job to sort out everything. And then like me, well, you know, if I take a keep cup to work, then I've done my job. Now you actually referenced towards this that actually we need a lot more people taking kind of action through their jobs. Because you're not going to have everybody being a sustainability manager. They're only going to be a tiny percentage of any organisation. So just be curious about how you're thinking on the panel's thoughts on how we kind of do what Lawyers for Net Zero are doing with the in-house legal community, but across all sort of influential professions.
Yeah. Why don't you go first? I definitely have something to contribute to that conversation given my origins.
I'll be quick and I'll just go back to Jerry Maguire, show me the money. It has to be an investable agenda where the incentives are aligned. If you're expecting somebody who has 5 kids and can't feed their family to choose a $9 heirloom tomato over a Big Mac, then that is not the rational economic choice for them. If you're expecting, some grad in your team to want to join your team, the Net Zero Avengers or whatever, then they have to be certain that they're not going to be sidelined in the business or not rewarded or whatever. There's something about the point about mainstreaming integration. It's great that green is cool. I am living proof of that right now, or uncool. But that's happening. Rhianne Marie Thomas, who many of you will all know, CEO of the Green Finance Institute, she said when she left Barclays that all of the babies wanted to work in her team. And so that's great, the new talent is coming through, but if we can't align incentives at the top, then we miss the opportunity. We've only got another couple of years, so green is cool.
If I just do a bit of law, then you can come back to your part, because the end of the question was also other parts of the professional world. Okay, so things have moved on. And I'm really pleased at what you're doing. I know some of the folk involved in your enterprise, and it's fantastic because you are in a position of significant influence. You can be in conversations where the answer ends up no, you can't do that. But you'll also be in conversations where you're ready to say, if you do it this way, it would be better. You are actually good at all. When I started the Centre for International Environmental Law in 1989, there was a moment when it was a great excitement about the possibility of using law to protect the environment, and it travelled across the Atlantic, and there was something really invigorating. We did attract very talented people to work in that area, and our courses at university were well attended, and a whole cadre of folk who were excited and interested went out into the world. But every now and again, there's a dip, there's a recession, or there's some other reason, and people, unless they're really determined, can lose faith. Even when I was counsel to a big law firm, there are people who wanted to work with me whose careers suffered, right?
James.
Yeah, no kidding. You go and work with James, you've got no chance. Now, of course, those people...
Are you in the audience? Whose career has suffered because of James?
I can name those. Because I didn't forget them. Right? But I mentioned they had to leave that law firm and stay working with me. And they've done all right since. But inside the commercial law firm, it wasn't good to work with me. Right? Long time later, it was appreciated. But at the time, an associate was basically told, it's not how the wedding, your career won't progress if you work with that guy. So you really do need perseverance and ultimately a sense that things will come your way, they'll turn your way, and you need help, you need guidance, you need mentors, you need people who will lend support and pick you up when other aspects of the profession knock you down. Right? But there are other parts of the world that need this too, right?
Reflecting on what both of you said, that people in firms who want to transition or start to incorporate those aspects of what they could do in terms of sustainability with their jobs do require support and guidance. And this kind of environment and what the Conduit facilitates and what online networks can facilitate are really, really important, because it's not always easy. The jobs are opening up, but it's not easy, and they do need to know that it is possible and this is a growing area. The thing I would also say is that leaders have to lead.
Yeah.
See, if it comes from the CEO that sustainability or how you behave a certain way is important, or ethics are important, or you care about ESG, then there's a chance.
Yeah.
Then the board can actually hear it. So I'm always fascinated by the fact that there are, I'm on a thing called Women on Boards.
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen a single sustainability board advisor post there, which fascinates me if this is so important. And also advising the board and the CEO on that element of what you're doing has to be a part of what we do in the future. So CEOs have to lead and boards have to support them.
Yep.
And James, I'm going to have 2 bites of the cherry. I'm so sorry, but it's just to say we enlightened whatever, but we can't be arrogant about being a bit further ahead. So I spoke to the CEO of a bank, an Australian bank, the other day, and he said, well, all our buildings are renewables now, shoulder pats. Yeah. And I said, oh, really? Good for you. And he said, yeah, bloody hard to get that through, really good. I said, oh, you're one of the biggest food and ag blenders. What are you doing there? Because you're pretty exposed, and it's also, 30% of emissions come from ag, and how's that going? Australia's hot. a lot of drought. How's it going? He said, oh, it's really interesting. I haven't thought about that as related to climate at all. At all, full stop. Food and ag was not part of it, but his buildings were renewable, which was good for him. And I think my first reaction was sort of eye-rolling, thinking, oh my God, I'm terrified for you and I'm terrified for my country. But I think I just wanted to say that in terms of the transition and the enlightened group can't have my first reaction, which was a bit horrified. But it has to be one of education and bringing people along.
Bringing people along, exactly. Freddie, how are we doing at time? We can do it? Okay, cool. Hello.
Hello, Sam Amrood, I'm a tech for good entrepreneur. And I was wondering, what role do you think that exponential deep tech ventures are going to play in the tipping point to meeting our targets? And if they are going to play an important role, where in the ecosystem is the really high risk, high return impact capital to actually deliver those ventures? Because frankly, as an entrepreneur, I look quite jealously across at Silicon Valley where, on the back of a Think Peaks, you can raise $5 million to plant 1 trillion trees in arid regions of the world, which is the sort of numbers that are needed. And I haven't seen that in the impact ecosystems over here, and I'm sure it's there, but just please, where is it?
Totally brilliant point, and you're in the right room because the Conduit Club is trying very hard to be helpful at building that community of investors that gets why you want to do it and is going to be figuring out how to do it. But you're also quite right that our early stage risk capital venture community here is a whole lot smaller and isn't in any way equivalent to what you would find in Silicon Valley. I'd like to think that that's changing quite fast because of this theme. And I do see people expanding their role. I've been involved with the IP group here that has been successful at tech investing generally, has now created a new sort of division, a new entity that's going to focus on climate change and innovation. As I mentioned before, this new Centre for Climate Change Innovation between Imperial College and the Royal Institution is designed expressly to make the connection between science, technology, incubator labs, accelerators, capital formation. Lots of the early supporters of that new enterprise are focused entirely on that problematic you set up. And without doubt, the potential for the exponential in technology to work in favour of this transition is visible. It's visible particularly, as we said before, in the power sector. But actually, what's really encouraging is that the forces that are at play in digitisation are so useful for the data gathering and monitoring and all the stuff that Vian was talking about before. So it's not just in the more obvious hard technology application. We're certainly going to do a lot of work on carbon removals, and there'll be a technology play there for sure. But it works also in support of, valuing nature and investing in natural systems and finding ways of validating methodologies that reward the removal of carbon or productivity of soils or some other value we've got. So I do see a massive opportunity for technology to play a part, and we want to bring it forward for sure. And this organisation here will help.
Do we have any other questions? There is another one online from Caroline Cantor who asks, how do you think this energy crisis has changed opinions on renewable energy?
Changed opinions? You want to do that, sure?
Who's going to take that one?
Why don't I start? Why do you think? Well, harsh truth is I hope it hasn't made a blind bit of difference to renewables, because it's not much to do with renewables. I mean, I think it focuses attention on market formation, market design. The fundamental reasons for that price spike are to do with the gas market, the global gas market. A lot of the companies that have suffered because of the way the market is designed and because they didn't properly cope, or they couldn't cope with hedging risk because the price rise was so great, so quick. The media hasn't quite understood that none of those companies are really energy companies. They don't make anything in particular. They're intermediaries in the marketplace. But some of the other companies that are now going to have to pick up the slack are very aware that they will need to cope with volatility, particularly in the gas market. But I hope it tells you that more renewables will be more stable, contrary to many people's point of view. I mean, that to have a more substantial proportion of the energy market covered by renewables would actually help with that sort of volatility. But the system has to be designed around that capacity, and it still isn't. So the regulator is aware of the potential of renewables to have a higher proportion of the marketplace, but the infrastructure we've got was not designed around those technologies. And we still have discussions about base load that are not really relevant anymore, and immediately people rush to whatever the last generation solution was, and they don't think where we were headed anyway that was positive, namely more renewables, more storage, and more digital demand side management, and more use of the technologies that link them. So there's a big technology challenge being risen to, I think, by many companies, which is how best to integrate those technologies, how best to join renewables, storage, digital demand side management, electric vehicle infrastructure, all of which need to be connected with data. But our current grid, our current energy system, our current regulation of the grid isn't designed around those technologies. So we're going to have to change it. But that's all upside from my point of view. That's all promise. So I hope the current energy crisis helps us think positively about the change. It always reminds us of who loses most from that rapid shift in price. So the unequal distribution of risk and cost is a serious political issue and should give us requirement, not just pause for thought, but requirement to think how that energy market functions effectively. And we don't have people simply not able to heat homes. Frankly, we shouldn't be relying upon gas to heat their homes anyway, but that's another story we should come to.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is it makes me recall the dinner I was at in Scotland. We were in a room full of deep thinkers, policymakers and CEOs, and it reminded me of the importance of understanding how carefully the transition needs to be managed, even though we need to do it fast. But there will be shocks along the way, it will be volatile along the way, and it's very important that those considerations are factored in to how we handle this next 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, for sure.
And just also how, as you say, misinformation can create real issues, and whether that's a Gilets jaunes movement, whether that's media sort of hyping things up, it's just important to have that in the back of our minds that these types of events can create a lot of misunderstanding as well.
Yeah. Now, what was the question back there, Alex?
Do we have time?
What's Freddie? Okay, cool. Yeah.
Do we have time?
Yes, go ahead.
So you talked a lot about incentives, and rightly so, but corporations, companies and institutions respond both to incentives but also to penalties, and anybody who sits in the boardroom understands that clearly. So the question is, in the first instance you have an issue about accountability and how do you measure it. You can't really apply penalties until you've got that, but once you have got that and you've got some kind of standardised way of measuring accountability, what role do you think penalties bring into the equation, and is the impunity just too cheap?
So we were having a conversation before we started about the role of law, and I probably do have a bias given my profession, where I started at least. I'm also very, very attuned to the rule of law as well as the role of law, that many of the problems we face are associated with abuse of power. And you need your legal system to be able to confront that abuse of power, and there are occasionally really obvious, egregious abuses, but sometimes there's a more insidious, gradual, a sort of steady corruption of basic ideas that can really destroy value in a society, and you have to react, and sometimes we react too slowly to that. So the role of law, the rule of law, access to justice, accountability in law, these are all absolutely critical factors. I happen to retain a pretty strongly idealistic view of the law. I see it as a will to perfection in our society. It's the way we express the best of ourselves. It's the way we understand the worst of ourselves and guard against it. But you need, obviously in a democracy, you need democratic processes to produce those rules and enforce those rules fairly. We need the separation of powers to be paid attention to, so judges feel free to challenge abuse of power in political hands. And these are live contentious issues in many societies, including our own. But I do think that we are seeing signs in some of the key areas of the economy, including in finance, that we're moving out of a voluntary phase into something more mandatory. Disclosure was mentioned. One of the things I hope is that all the effort we're putting right now to the voluntary carbon market, and Mark Carney is doing his best to promote all of that, is in part a way of finding out how best to have a compliance market involving a large section of the economy. We've already had some experimentation there, we need to be a lot better at that. That does at least create some enforceable, actionable penalty for breach. I'd like to think that we don't have to populate the entirety of our civic reaction to the climate change issue with rules. But unless there is some hard constraint to the behaviours, to the decision-making powers that we have, I'm afraid we can't just leave it to our best hopes for, even our best hopes for innovation. We are going to have to constrain emissions. And that's why I wanted to make this point about creativity and constraint. I think if we're serious about the constraint, we will have creativity too. And we shouldn't think of the interventions that governments can make as in some way sort of a negative response. I think they can be very positive, but they have to be well designed, right?
I'm interested in adding the overlay of how the market then acts as an anti-incentive, i.e. once the regulator has enforced or has created constraints about what's appropriate or not in the area of carbon emissions or any other aspect of ESG, I'm interested in how then the market will start to price those in and penalise companies that are not living up to what other companies might be living up to. So if there's a choice between company A and company B, then perhaps the capital will flow into company B or company A, depending on what the ESG profile is. I do think it's interesting. I'd be interested in your views on this. It is very early in this market. We are very early days. It's just evolving, and I think sometimes we forget that. And I know we have to go really fast, but I think this is a journey, and we're getting there. So let's see how this evolves.
Kat, last word.
Ooh, have fun. I guess it's just, for me, consistency is really important. So the Environment Bill came in and said, if you're a company and you are deforesting in any jurisdiction, in any part of your supply chain, you've got to do due diligence. So it doesn't matter if you're sourcing palm from Indonesia, soy from Brazil, you've got to know about it. And if it is illegal deforestation, you can't do it. The same thing doesn't apply to financial institutions yet in the UK. So consistency so that you avoid some of those potential to play the game, but also just on penalties and decision making and governance. 5 words: get more women on boards.
Okay, well, I think we're done, Freddie, are we? We're done.
I think we're just about at time, so thank you hugely for that discussion, and thank you to all of you for being here and for